"Step away from her." The words were not loud. Coldest, Duke of Thornleigh, had never in his life needed to raise his voice, and he did not raise it now. Yet they carried the length of the marble hall as though he had struck a bell, and 100 wedding guests went still between one breath and the next. The quartet in the gallery faltered on a phrase, and let it die. A footman froze with a tray of champagne suspended at his shoulder. Even the great chandelier seemed to hold its light, its 1,000 crystals catching the candle flame and refusing to let it tremble. At the center of that sudden silence stood a young woman in a plain grey gown, and beside her, gripping her wrist white-knuckled, stood the man Thornleigh had spoken to. Her name was Marianne Croll, and until this moment she had been the least regarded person in the room. He had watched her for the better part of an hour, though no one, least of all Marianne herself, had known it. A duke may stand at the edge of a wedding breakfast with a glass he does not drink and observe everything, and no one will trouble him, because a man of his rank and his reputation is understood to want to be left alone. Thornleigh was known throughout 3 counties as a cold man. Not cruel, they were careful to say, for cruelty could be gossiped about with relish, and there was nothing to gossip about in Thornleigh. He was simply cold. He did not dance. He did not flatter. He gave to his tenants what was owed and a little more, and expected nothing warmer than good work in return. Mothers with daughters had long since given up on him, and were half relieved too, for his silences unnerved them. So he had stood at the edge, and he had watched. The wedding was that of a Miss Prudence Faraday to a baronet's son, and the Faraday house had been decked for it until it groaned. There were hothouse lilies enough to bury a smaller family, and a cake like a fortress, and the mother of the bride moved through her rooms with the fixed, glittering smile of a woman who has spent a great deal of money and intends everyone to know it. Thornleigh had come only because the groom's father had once done him a service in Parliament, and a debt was a debt. He had meant to stay an hour and go. He had noticed the girl in grey because she was the only person in the room doing anything useful. While the fine ladies drifted and preened, Marianne Croll moved. She caught a toppling candelabra before it could set a curtain alight, and no one thanked her. She knelt to gather the spilled beads of a dowager's broken bracelet and returned them, every one, into the old woman's palm. She steadied a tipsy young man toward a chair before he could disgrace himself in front of his betrothed's family, and did it so quietly that only Thornleigh, watching, understood what she had prevented. She was some poor relation of the Faradays, he gathered, a cousin twice removed, kept up a house to be useful and reminded of it. Her gown had been turned at least once. He could see the faint ghost of an old hem below the new. Her hands were a working woman's hands. And her face, when it was not composed into the careful blankness of someone accustomed to being overlooked, was the most quietly arresting thing he had seen in a decade of ballrooms. He had watched her, and he had thought, with the mild surprise of a man discovering an unexpected coin in an old coat, "There is the only person here I should like to speak to." Then the trouble had begun. It began, as such things do, small. A necklace of the bride's had gone missing from an upstairs dressing room, a modest thing of garnets. But the bride wanted it for the moment of departure, and when it could not be found, a ripple of unease had run through the household and then through the guests. Mrs. Faraday's glittering smile had thinned, and into that unease had stepped a man named Croll. Thornleigh knew of Julian Croll. Everyone did. He was a cousin of the groom's, a handsome, idle, expensive young man with a genius for arranging that his own faults be discovered in someone else's pocket. Twice before, in Thornleigh's hearing, small ruin had followed wherever Croll owed money, and each time the ruin had landed on someone too poor to answer back. Thornleigh had never troubled to intervene. It had not been his affair. He watched Croll's eyes move around the room. He watched them find Marianne Croll in her turned grey gown, the poor relation, the one no one would defend, and settle there with the ease of a man selecting a chair. "I saw her go up," Croll said. He did not shout it. He said it just loudly enough, to just the right person, and let it travel. The little grey cousin, on the stair not 10 minutes past. I thought nothing of it at the time. The words moved through the room like cold water finding the cracks. Heads turned. And Marianne Croll, who had been quietly refilling an old woman's cup of tea, looked up and understood, in the space of a heartbeat, exactly what was about to be done to her. Thornleigh saw her understand it. That was the thing he would remember afterward, Not the accusation, which was ordinary, but her face as she met it. She'd not flush or stammer or fling out denials. She set down the teapot with a steadiness that must have cost her everything, straightened her spine and lifted her chin, and looked directly at the man who was destroying her, as though she would at least make him do it to her face. "I have not been upstairs since morning, Mr. Croll," she said. Her voice was low and even. "You are mistaken, or you are lying. I think you know which. It was well done. It was too well done." Trembling denial the room might have pitied. A poor relation who answered a gentleman back with that much composure only convinced the watchers that she must be guilty, for what innocent creature of no consequence would dare? Mrs. Faraday's smile had gone entirely. "Marianne," she said, and there was a whole life of small resentments in the way she said the name. "You will come with me. We will search your room and settle this quietly, before you shame us all." "You will not need to search my room," Marianne said. "There is nothing in it that is not mine." "Then you will have no objection," said Croll, and smiled and took her by the wrist. That was the moment. He took her by the wrist, this idle, handsome liar, and his fingers closed hard enough that Thornleigh saw the girl's jaw tighten against the pain of it. And he began to draw her toward the door, toward the small, cold, private ruin that awaited girls of no consequence, the dismissal, the note that would follow her to every house that might have taken her, the slow closing of every door. She did not cry out. She went with her chin up, refusing him even the satisfaction of her fear, and Thornleigh, who had not intervened in a decade, who did not raise his voice, who had come to stay an hour and go, set down his untouched glass on the tray of the frozen footman and spoke. "Step away from her." Now the whole room was his. He crossed it without hurry. That was the thing that frightened them. He knew not speed, but its absence. A furious man may be shouted down or waited out. A calm one, moving slowly through a silent hall with his eyes fixed on you, is a different order of thing. He came to a stop an arm's length from Julian Croll, and he looked, deliberately, at the man's fingers where they gripped Marianne Cole's wrist, and he waited. Croll let go. "Your Grace," he said, and produced a smile that had melted many a drawing-room. "You have wandered into a small domestic matter. A theft, I'm sorry to say. The girl was seen, by you," Thornleigh said. "By me. 10 minutes past, on the stair." Thornleigh's voice remained perfectly level. "I know. I heard you say it. I heard you say it very carefully to Lady Bramwell, who has the loudest voice in the county, so that it would be well spread before anyone thought to ask a question." A little sound went through the room, half a gasp, quickly swallowed. "You mistake me," Croll began. "I do not think I do." Thornleigh had not looked away from him. "I have been standing at that window for the better part of an hour, Mr. Croll. I am a dull man. I find I would rather watch a room than talk in it. So I will tell you what I watched. I watched this woman." He did not look at Marianne. He kept his eyes on Croll, for it was Croll who needed to feel watched. Catch a falling candelabra that would have set that curtain alight and burnt this house to its cellars, and no one thanked her. I watched her return every bead of Lady Osric's bracelet. I watched her spend an hour being useful in a house that treats her as furniture. And in that hour, Mr. Croll, she did not once go upon the stair. I would have seen her. I see everything in this room. I saw you go up." The silence changed its quality. Before it had been the silence of scandal. Now it was something sharper, the silence of 100 people recalculating at once. For years afterward, guests who had been in that hall would disagree about many details of the evening, the colour of the bride's gown, the exact hour, whether Lady Bramwell had swooned or merely sat down very suddenly. But on one point they never disagreed. They all remembered the moment the Duke of Thornleigh, who never spoke, said the accusation was false, and the whole shape of the room turned over like a card. It is a curious thing, the weight of a reputation. Thornleigh had spent 15 years being cold, and the coldness had cost him a great deal. Friends he might have made, evenings he might have enjoyed, a warmth he had told himself he did not want. But it bought him in this single hour a thing no charm could have bought: absolute belief. A charming man who accused Julian Croll would have been suspected of some quarrel, some rivalry over cards or a woman. A cold man, a man famous for never troubling himself with anyone's affairs, a man who gave nothing away and asked nothing back. When such a man crossed a room and spent himself, every soul present understood at once that it must be true, because what on earth could he possibly gain? He had no stake in the poor grey cousin. He had never met her. He was simply, unbearably, telling the truth, and the truth from Thornleigh's mouth had the force of law. He had known that. Somewhere beneath the calm, in the cold heart of him that had watched rooms for 15 years, he had known exactly what his silence was worth and had chosen, in a single instant, to spend the whole of it on a woman he could not have picked out of a crowd an hour before. He did not stop to wonder why. There would be time later, in a great echoing house, to wonder why. In the hall there was only the certainty, sharp as a struck bell, not this one, not while I am standing here. Croll's smile did not fall so much as thin, like ice over deep water. That is a very grave thing to say to a gentleman, your grace, before witnesses. I hope you can stand behind it. I never say anything I cannot stand behind, Thornleigh replied. It is why I say so little. You went up not 15 minutes ago, by the servant's stair at the end of the passage, the one the family does not use, and so the one no one watches. You were gone perhaps 4 minutes. You came down by the front stair, adjusting your coat. I noticed it because I had spent the hour noticing that this woman never left the room, and a man who watches one thing carefully sees a good deal of what happens beside it. He let that sit. Then, still without hurry, he turned his head for the first time and looked at Marianne Croll. She was staring at him. Of course she was. She had spent her life being looked past, and here was a duke describing an hour of her existence in front of 100 people who had never once troubled to learn her name. Her wrist, where Croll had held it, had reddened. Her chin was still up. But something in her eyes had come loose, some braced thing that had been holding, and now did not know whether it might let go. You are Miss Croll, he said to her. It was not a question. He had learned her name from a footman 20 minutes before, the way he learned everything, by asking a quiet man a quiet question and paying for the answer with courtesy. Yes, she said. You told the truth just now, and it cost you the room, because the truth told calmly by a poor woman is taken for insolence. He said it plainly as a fact, not a comfort. I am sorry for that. It is a stupid arrangement, and I have profited by it all my life, and I am tired of it. He turned back to Croll. The garnets, Mr. Croll. I should be very much obliged if you would empty the left pocket of your coat. The inner one. You keep touching it. Croll had indeed touched it, twice, small unconscious movements, the way a man will reassure himself of a thing he means to be rid of later. He stopped touching it now. His face, so smooth all evening, had gone the colour of tallow. I will do no such thing, he said. I am not to be searched like a footman on the word of, on my word, said Thornleigh. And for the first time there was something under the level tone, some cold weight of the man's whole rank and fortune and reputation, moving beneath the calm surface the way the true size of a thing shows only when it turns. You may empty your pocket here, quietly, before these people, and give the garnets to Mrs. Faraday, and I will say nothing further tonight, and you may leave this country by whatever door you find. Or you may refuse, and I will send for the constable, and I will stand as a witness, a duke, Mr. Croll, before a magistrate, that I watched you go up the servants' stair, and I will let the law do to you slowly and publicly what you meant to do to this woman quickly and in the dark. Choose. I am a patient man, but I find tonight that my patience has an edge to it I did not know it had. The room did not breathe. For a long moment Julian Croll looked at the Duke of Thornleigh, and he saw, as everyone in that hall now saw, that there was no bluff to call. Slowly, with a hand that had begun to shake, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a small string of garnets, dark red as old wine, and let them pour into his own palm, and stood holding them, exposed, while 100 people watched. Mrs. Faraday made a small strangled sound. Give them to your hostess, Thornleigh said, quite gently now, as one might speak to a beaten animal, and go. Croll crossed to Mrs. Faraday. He laid the garnets in her nerveless hand. He did not look at Marianne Croll, and he did not look at the Duke, and he walked the length of that silent, staring room with the whole county watching the ruin of him, and he went out through the great doors into the night, and the story of it would be at every breakfast table in 3 counties by noon the following day. He would not be received again. He had ruined poorer people than himself for years, and it had cost him nothing, and now it had cost him everything, in an evening, in front of everyone, and the reason was a poor cousin in a turned grey gown whom no one had thought worth a single word. The doors closed behind him, and Thornleigh, who ought perhaps to have felt some triumph, felt instead only a great weariness, and turned to find that the 100 faces had swung around to the one person who could not possibly have expected them. Marianne Croll stood in the centre of the marble hall with a duke beside her and a whole society staring, and she looked more than anything as though she wished the floor would open. He understood. To be scorned is one thing. A person learns to bear the weight of being unseen. To be suddenly, blazingly, publicly seen is another, and there is no practice for it. Mrs. Faraday, he said, without waiting for the room to recover its tongue, I find I have imposed on your hospitality long enough, and I have kept my carriage too long from its stable. But I should not like to leave a matter half mended. This lady has been accused before your guests of a theft she did not commit, and cleared before your guests of it. That is well. But an accusation of that kind leaves a stain that a mere clearing does not lift, and we all of us know it. A shadow will follow her. Was she quite exonerated, or was it hushed for the Duke's sake? And it will follow her into every house she might have hoped to serve or to enter, and it will close doors that ought to have been open. I have seen it done 100 times. I will not see it done tonight. He turned to Marianne, and here he knew he was about to do a thing that could not be undone before more witnesses than had ever watched him do anything, and he found, this was the strangest part, that he did not hesitate. Miss Croll, he said, I have watched you for 1 hour, and in that hour you were kinder and cleverer and braver than any soul in this room, myself included. I am a cold man. I am told so often enough that I have come to believe it. I have never in my life wished to say to anyone the thing I am about to say to you, and I say it knowing it is graceless and sudden and in front of a great many people who will talk of nothing else for a month. I do not care. Will you do me the honor, not tonight, not on a whim, but truly, when you have had time to think and to refuse me if you wish, of allowing me to call on you, properly, as a man calls on a woman he means to court? The silence that followed that was of an entirely different order from all the silences before it. The carriage stood in the drive under a sky pricked hard with stars, and the lamps beside its door threw a small warm pool of light onto the gravel, and into that light the Duke of Thornleigh walked with an emptiness in his chest he could not name. He had done a great thing and an unwise thing in the same quarter of an hour, and both had felt at the time like the only possible thing, and now that was over he found he did not regret a single word of it, which unsettled him more than regret would have. His coachman had the door open. Thornleigh paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at the great lit house, at the tall windows blazing with candle flame and full of moving figures who were, all of them, at this moment, talking about him. He had spent 15 years arranging his life so that no one talked about him. He discovered that he did not, tonight, care in the least. "Home, your grace?" the coachman asked. "Home, Perry," he said, and got in, and the carriage rocked forward, and the lit house slid away behind the black hedges. And Thornleigh sat in the dark with his own heartbeat, and the memory of a woman in a turned grey gown who had refused a duke to his face in front of 100 people because she was too proud to be rescued and too honest to pretend otherwise. He should not have said it. That was the sensible verdict, and he arrived at it somewhere on the long, dark road, and rejected it before the next mile-post. He had offered marriage, or the road to it, to a stranger, on the strength of 1 hour, in front of the worst-tongued society in the county, and any sane man would spend the drive home cold with mortification. He was not cold. He realized, with something close to alarm. The opposite of cold for the first time in 15 years, and the thing that had thawed him was the image of her chin coming up as Croll took her wrist, that small proud refusal of fear, that had gone into him like a key into a lock he had not known was there. He did not sleep much that night. He stood a long while at the window of his study, where the fire had burned low, and watched the dark park and thought about walls. He had built his brick by brick over a boyhood in this same house, a house his father had ruled with silences longer and colder than any Thornleigh had ever managed, silences that a small motherless boy had learned to read as weather, to move quietly beneath, to survive. He had learned young that to want a thing openly was to hand someone the means to wound you, and that the safest man was the man who wanted nothing anyone could see. He had grown into it. He had grown so far into it that the county had a name for it, cold, and he had worn the name like a coat and half believed it was his skin. And then a poor woman had told the truth calmly in a crowded room and been punished for it, and something in him that he had walled up at the age of 9 had put both hands against the wall and pushed. He wrote to her the next morning, not a proposal, she had asked for slow, and he meant to give her slow, but a plain, short note in his own hand without flourish, that he had meant every word, that he would call in a week as he had said, that if in that week she wished to send back a single line telling him never to come, he would honor it and trouble her no further. He signed it not with his title but with his name, Aldous, which almost no one living had ever called him, and sealed it with his signet ring pressed into the wax, and sent it before he could reconsider. She did not send back a line telling him never to come. He called in a week, as he had said. The first call was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster, and he treasured it all his life. He came to the Faraday house. She had not yet removed to Lady Osric's, and was shown into a parlour that had been hastily got up to receive a duke, and there sat Mrs. Faraday, transformed. All smiles and small cakes, and a manner so newly and violently warm toward her poor cousin that Thornleigh's stomach turned. Marianne sat in the corner where the light was worst in the same grey gown, and watched her cousin perform affection, and her face was perfectly composed and told him everything. He endured Mrs. Faraday for exactly as long as courtesy strictly required, and not 1 minute longer. Then he said, "Mrs. Faraday, I wonder if I might have the favour of a turn in your garden with Miss Croll. The afternoon is fine, and I confess I have my fill of fine parlours this season." Out of doors, on a gravel path between clipped hedges, with a decent distance between them and the parlour windows, he found he did not know how to begin. He, who was famous for never wasting a word, stood beside a woman he had crossed a room to save and could not think of one to say. She let the silence run. She seemed comfortable in it, which nobody ever was with him, and after a while he understood that she was letting him find his footing, the way she had steadied the tipsy young man toward his chair, quietly, so that he need not know he was being helped. "I am not good at this," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "You are much better at the other thing, the crossing of rooms, the 4 terrible words. That you did beautifully." She glanced at him sidelong. "This, the garden and the small talk, you do very badly. It is rather a relief. I was afraid you would be good at everything." And he laughed. It came out of him rough and startled, a sound he had not made in years, and she looked pleased with herself, and something in his chest that had been braced since the age of 9 let go a fraction more. After that it was easier. Not easy. He would never be easy, but easier. He came the next week and the week after, and when she removed to Lady Osric's household he came there instead, glad of it, for the Dowager's small warm parlour had no glittering cousin performing love in it. Only an old woman who dozed frankly in her chair by the fire and woke now, and then to say something devastatingly shrewd and doze off again. In that room, over the slow weeks, the Duke of Thornleigh courted Marianne Croll and learned her, and was learned by her, and came unwalled a little more each visit, until one grey afternoon he looked up from something she had said and realized with a plain quiet certainty, like coming into a room he had been walking toward all his life, that he loved her, and had for weeks, and that the whole of his cold, careful existence had been a long waiting for exactly this. There was a difficulty, of course. There is always a difficulty, and Thornleigh, who had lived long enough to distrust anything that came without one, had been waiting for it. It came in the form of his aunt. Lady Sabine Vaughan, his late mother's sister and the nearest thing to a mother he had known, a small upright woman of 70 with a spine of pig iron and a tongue to match, who descended upon Thornleigh one afternoon in a cloud of black bombazine and lavender water, and demanded to know whether the county had lost its mind or only her nephew. "They are saying," she announced, before she had properly sat down, "that you mean to marry a servant." "They are saying wrong then," Thornleigh said, ringing for tea. "I mean to marry a gentleman's daughter who has been kept as a servant by relations who ought to be ashamed. It is a distinction Miss Croll has borne with more grace than I could have, and I have not, in fact, asked her yet. She has refused so far to be hurried." That checked his aunt. She sat down after all. "She has refused to be hurried," she repeated, "by you, by me." Lady Sabine's sharp old eyes narrowed. A poor woman, dependent, without prospects, handed the attentions of a duke, and she declines to be hurried. She was silent a moment, and Thornleigh, who had learned to read her as he had learned to read weather, watched a grudging respect move across her face like light across water. "Well," she said at last, "that is not what I expected. I expected a scheming little nobody with her claws in your fortune. I came to save you from her. You need not. I am past saving. I have wanted nothing for 15 years, and now I want one thing entirely, and I intend to have it if she will have me, and I would take it kindly, not if you would meet her before you decide to disapprove. You are a fair woman under the bombazine. You were always fairer than my father." He had not meant to say that last. It came out on its own. His aunt's face changed, some old shared grief passing between them, some memory of the cold house and the cold man who had ruled it, and the two children, herself and her sister, who had grown up beneath the same silence as he had. She reached over, this fierce old woman, and put her hand briefly over his, which she had not done since he was a boy. "Your father," she said, "would have crossed that room too, Aldous, once, before he taught himself not to. It is the only thing I ever forgave him, that under all the ice there had once been a man who would have crossed a room. You have his face. I have always been afraid you had the rest of him too, the ice without the man beneath it." She sat back. "Bring me your gentleman's daughter who will not be hurried. I should like to see the woman who thawed you. If she is what you say, I shall love her better than I have loved anyone in this family since your mother died, and I shall tell the county so loudly, until it stops its wagging." She met Marianne the following week. The two women took each other's measure across Lady Osric's fire like a pair of duelists, and within the half-hour were talking over Thornleigh's head as though he were furniture. And within the hour Lady Sabine had appropriated Marianne entirely and begun to plan the wedding neither of them had yet been asked to. Thornleigh sat and watched the two people he loved best in the world conspire to arrange his life, and felt the last brick of the old wall go quietly to dust, and did not mourn it. He proposed a fortnight after that, not in a crowded hall but in Lady Osric's garden, on the same gravel path where he had once been unable to think of a word to say. He managed rather more words this time. He told her he was cold and difficult and mended slowly, and would try her patience to the end of both their lives, and that he had loved her since the moment her chin came up in the marble hall, and that he had spent 15 years wanting nothing and would spend the rest of it, if she permitted. Wanting only her, she let him finish. Then she said, "You told the whole world you meant to court me before I had said a word. It is only fair that I answer you where the whole world cannot hear, so that this at least is ours." She took both his hands. "Yes, Aldous. Slowly and difficultly and to the end of both our lives. Yes." Marianne Croll looked at him. She did not swoon, and she did not weep, and she did not seize the offer as a drowning woman seizes a rope, which was what the room and Mrs. Faraday most of all plainly expected of a poor cousin handed a duke. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice, though it shook a little now, was still her own. "You have been very kind. You have been kinder to me in an hour than this house has been in 3 years, and I will not pretend I am not grateful. I am, more than I can say without disgracing myself. But you have known me for 1 hour. You have watched me across a room. You do not know me at all. And I have learned, being what I am, to be very careful of kindness offered in front of a crowd, because a crowd is not there tomorrow, when the kindness must be lived out in a quiet room with no one watching." Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped at the impudence of it. Thornleigh, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt his mouth want to smile. "You are quite right," he said. "That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give, and exactly the answer that proves I am not wrong. I have known a great many people who would have taken the Duke and asked no questions. I have never before met one who would refuse to be rescued twice in one evening. Then let it be as you say, not a rescue. A courtship, slow and proper in quiet rooms, with your leave to send me away the moment I bore or offend you. May I begin by learning your name well enough to say it to your face without a footman's help?" "It is Marianne," she said. "Marianne," he repeated, as if committing it to the same careful memory that held every falling candelabra of the evening. "Then, Marianne, with your permission, I will call in a week." He bowed to her, deeply the bow a man gives an equal, in front of 100 people who had watched her humiliated a quarter of an hour before, and he took his leave. He called in a week. He called the week after that. Mrs. Faraday, who had spent 3 years reminding Marianne Croll of her dependence, discovered overnight that her poor cousin was a personage, and grew so effusive that Marianne quietly arranged to remove to the household of the Dowager Lady Osric, she of the returned bracelet beads, who wanted a companion and had liked, she said, the look of a girl who could count every bead of an old woman's ruin and hand them all back. It was there in a small warm parlour that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender, with a fire snapping in the grate and no crowd anywhere in it, that the Duke of Thornleigh did his true courting, and it was slow. He had promised her slow, and he found to his own surprise that he wanted it so. A cold man does not know at first how to be warm, he only knows how to be honest, which is a beginning. He told her things he had never told a living soul, of a father who had prized silence and called it strength, of a great house that echoed, of a decade of standing at the edges of rooms because it seemed safer than being in them. And she listened the way she did everything entirely and gave him back the truth in the same coin. She told him of parents lost young, of the long apprenticeship of being useful and unthanked, of the particular loneliness of the person everyone relies on and no one sees. He learned that she read voraciously and argued well and laughed, when she truly laughed, with a suddenness that undid him. He learned that her steadiness in the hall that night had not been coldness but courage held very tightly in both hands, and that under it she was the warmest creature he had ever known, and that the warmth had simply never before been asked for. "You called yourself a cold man," she said to him one evening months in, when the courtship had ceased to be a courtship and become something they both knew and neither had yet named. The firelight moved on the plain silk of her gown, finer now than grey, though she had refused anything grand until they were wed, and would refuse it, he suspected, all her life. "The night we met, you said it as though it were a fact about you, like your height. I believed it," he said. "You crossed a room full of people you had every reason to leave undisturbed, and you spent every scrap of your standing in the world to save a woman you had never spoken to, because you could not bear to watch her wronged." She looked at him steadily, as she had looked at Croll, as she had looked at the whole staring hall. "I have met cold men, Aldous. You are the warmest person I have ever known. You had only got so used to keeping it behind a wall that you mistook the wall for yourself." He had no answer for that. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, the working woman's hand, that had caught the falling candelabra, that had counted out the beads, and he held it, and that was answer enough. They were married in the spring, in the small parish church near his estate, with no fortress of a cake and no lilies enough to bury a family, but with every tenant of Thornleigh crowded into the pews and spilling out the doors, for word had gone round of the Duke's bride and what she had been, and the people who worked his land had decided, without being asked, that they approved. Lady Osric wept into a very fine handkerchief and pretended it was the draught. Mrs. Faraday was not invited, and minded very much, and this was generally felt to be right. Marianne came up the aisle in a gown of pale silk and old lace, on no one's arm, for she had no father to give her, and had gently refused every substitute. She would come to him, she said, as herself, given away by no one and belonging to no one, and walk the last of the distance of her own free will. He watched her come. The whole church watched with him, but he had had a great deal of practice at watching one person in a crowded room, and he saw only her, the chin still up, the steadiness still costing her, the warmth breaking through it now like sun through the last of the winter. She reached him. She put her hand in his of her own accord, the way she did everything entirely. "You came to me," he said, low, only for her. "I told you I would," she said, "given away by no one, chosen by myself." And the smile broke, sudden, the one that undid him, "Choosing your grace of my own free will, before all these witnesses, so that no one may ever say I was rescued." "No," he agreed, and found his own voice was not entirely steady. "No one will ever say it. I watched you refuse to be rescued twice in one night. I have loved you for it every day since." The old parson cleared his throat and began, and the coldest man in 3 counties stood at the front of a country church. holding the hand of the woman 100 people had once been willing to see ruined for the price of a string of garnets, and understood that the wall he had mistaken for himself had come down quietly, without his quite noticing, some months before. The night he had crossed a marble hall and said 4 words into a frozen room, and been warm, for the first time in his life, in front of everyone. They lived long and they lived warmly, and the great house that had echoed for a generation grew full of firelight, of argument, of that sudden laughter, of small running feet upon the stairs in years to come. And to the end of his days, when anyone spoke of the Duke of Thornleigh as a cold man, his Duchess would only smile and say nothing and let them keep the wall. She knew what was behind it, she always had. She had seen it one evening across a crowded room at the exact moment he had seen her.